Welcome to Talking History at Eureka, streamed live from the Eureka Centre, Ballarat. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Waterworks people of the Kulin Nation. I also pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm Beth Kicinski. I'm an historian here in Ballarat. I like to investigate the 19th century metalworking industry and the people who were in it. So today I'm going to be talking specifically about the Phoenix Foundry, which was one of our biggest foundries here. So the Phoenix Foundry, it was established in March of 1857 on the site that it inhabited for the following 50 years. It was a small section of the block on which Central Square and Myer now stand. It was co-owned by four men, all from different backgrounds. And they came across at different times. So I have no idea, none of the research has been able to tell me how they got to know one another. I have to assume that they met at Ballarat. They began with an extraordinary marketing campaign. Up to this point, Ballarat had been inundated with blacksmiths, and there were things called foundries across the board, but their skills were mainly basic blacksmithing, repairs, that sort of thing. So they weren't doing anything else. These guys, though, were engineers. Only one other foundry existed at this point that was advertising at the same level. It was on the same block 2 doors away. Their engineering skills were probably quite extraordinary, looking at their pasts. One in particular, William Henry Shaw, who became the manager, had trained with a Belfast foundry that was quite well known for making steam engines for steamships. So he had extraordinary skills beyond the repair level. In early 1858, the eldest partner left, and left only 3, and their promotional strategy ramped up even further, pushing on their ability to do things that nobody else in Ballarat could do. I would actually categorise it as an aggressive promotional campaign. Looking at the partners, they'd left behind overfilled employment and business markets. They'd come from Ireland and Lancashire and places where the markets for foundries had exploded through the 1830s and 40s and then imploded as things like the cotton manufacturing industry died. So I can only assume they came to Ballarat looking for an opportunity to build an industry that they couldn't get any foot into back home. As far as Ballarat was concerned, in 1857 when they started, there was still little in the way of structured industry. It was quite chaotic on the goldfields. The roads were dust in summer and mud in winter. Everybody was living in tents, or nearly everybody was living in tents. But in January of 1856, the local council had been formed for the municipality. So there were indications that something more was going to happen. So building a foundry at that point that could do something of a higher class of industry seemed like it was probably an opportune moment. They began to increase the amount of work they were turning out for the mining industry over the next couple of years. Lots of reports in the local newspaper showing exactly what they were doing, although it's hard to tell from the brief descriptions exactly the quality of the work that they had to do. By late 1861, though, Ballarat had taken on a new sort of determination to become a modern city. And in the pages of the local newspaper, The Star, a series of articles were run called The Industries of Ballarat. And in the very first one was our foundries, and at the top of that was the Phoenix Foundry. I'm taking this as an indication that to the people of Ballarat, the Phoenix Foundry was actually something quite significant. It still only occupied a very small space on the street, but it was beginning to be used as a reference point in other people's advertising for where to find their businesses. So it must have had a physical presence. There's no photos at this point, but a decent physical presence to be coming to that point. So they had this, and that brought more contracts and more knowledge of them being there was repeated into other newspapers. In December of 1863, they began to change the shape of the business with the first contract for the Ballarat Waterworks. They'd been trying up to this point to get one, but this was the very first one they'd had, simply by dint of the fact that the Ballarat Waterworks couldn't get what they needed from outside suppliers. So we see an example here of Geoffrey Blaney's tyranny of distance coming into effect. However, this is also what I'm taking as a sample of, I argue against earlier interpretations of the Phoenix Foundry being a specialist in mining machinery. Yes, they made a lot of mining machinery at this point in time, but their advertising for their specialties was focused more on their capacity to build pipes and boilers, which were a highly specialised industry involving a sort of skill that only very experienced masters would have. They kept growing the business, and there were articles that would say they were making changes to the workforce, adding overseers, and some changes to the site itself, including building a smokestack to keep the smoke away from the streets. By mid-1865, advertising began to show they were reselling mining equipment. This is an indication that earlier interpretations, again, of the mining industry being a driver for the foundries and for blacksmithing in the area may be an overstatement. In fact, there was not as much work available as some people have earlier implied from the mining industry to the foundries with high engineering skills. Then in early 1866, mining investment in Ballarat became almost non-existent. And I see in the papers a change in that the Phoenix were chasing more payments on contracts through the local courts. And this activity went through the roof. So from the time they opened in 1857 till 1866, a 9-year patch, they'd had a decent run. We're beginning to feel the pinch of working in an industry that was starting to actually be reaching its capacity. The diversity of the work they were undertaking was also increasing significantly, and they were taking on lots of odd little jobs, making things like a door for a safe or parts for a weighbridge, rather than just sticking with the mining machinery they'd already been doing. In late 1866, residential constructions in Ballarat entered a period of high demand that would last 2 decades. This brought with it the need for infrastructure changes. And this was another opportunity for the Phoenix Foundry partners to try to revamp what they were doing and their promotions and everything else like that to get business elsewhere, particularly looking at things like the water supply, which they'd had a couple of contracts but couldn't consistently get work, and the gas supply, which was new. In 1857, Henry Webb Curtis created the first commercial gas producer in Ballarat, and he laid lines along Lydiard Street, up Sturt Street, across to Armstrong Street. But he couldn't get traction with the locals, and sold his business to the Ballarat Gas Company, which opened the following year. Unfortunately, as with Waterworks, The Phoenix Foundry couldn't seem to get their foot in the door for the gas supply works either. Those contracts went to Melbourne companies. So they were stuck with a deflated mining industry and very few options for growing the business. I saw, again, they shift their marketing to look at particularly Shaw's capacity to do boiler work. And they became involved in a local movement to start an insurance company that would see that all boilers on Ballarat would be tested on a regular basis, and it would also bring business, of course, to any of the businesses that foundries that were involved in this. There's not a lot through this period for me to be able to say about the people that were involved in it, beyond the fact that they developed a team of no more than 50 people in a 10-year period. That sounds reasonably significant, I suppose, for something where the bulk of people were living in tents. Other than that, the people leading all had young families, and I think this is a significant thing to keep in mind when you think about what they were trying to do at that time and their motivations for sticking with a business that wasn't doing so well at this point. In the late 1860s, in 1868 in fact, it was announced that we would have the railways rolling out across Victoria, and this brought some interest in Ballarat. A spot was designated on Lydiard Street for the railway station. Over 1869, a series of meetings were had between people at the Phoenix Foundry and distinguished members of the public to put together a business opportunity to make railway rolling stock specifically for the Victorian colonial government. It came to fruition in November of 1870. By April 1871, there were approximately 40 shareholders, and more than half of those were workers in the original foundry. I just want to point out here that I've called this slide distinction, but originally I'd had Reformation on there, based mainly upon all the histories I'd read that had mentioned this stage of the Phoenix Foundry being reformed. I'd like to point out that in fact I haven't called it that because that would be factually incorrect. The Phoenix Foundry about which I now talk, that is pictured on the screen, the Locomotive Works, is a separate business altogether, although it involved the men from the first foundry. The original Phoenix Foundry Works continued to work on its same site, side by side with this Locomotive Works, until 1873. So this is a separate one, but I'm treating it like it's an extension of the same business because they were involved. The deeds of this newly formed Locomotive Works, even though there were more than half of the shareholders were workers, it severely restricted eligibility for the directorate by naming a tremendous number of shares that had to be held to make you eligible. This went on to cause ongoing problems throughout the lifetime of the business. And it also caused problems early in the business. It wasn't an easy start. Multiple meetings were held in which the deeds were altered. Very hard to find evidence of what those deeds alterations were, but some were to do with changing the eligibility for membership so that Shaw could become a director, changing the designation of shares, again restricting some more members from becoming members of the directorate and giving more power into others. And there were meetings to do with finances because they couldn't get what they needed, even though they'd secured a government contract to build locomotives. They couldn't get the money to build the infrastructure they needed to actually create the foundry that you can see before you. It's only through the generosity of a single shareholder that the long history of the Phoenix Foundry was possible, lawyer John Hardy put forward his own securities to ensure a £10,000 loan could be had to send William Shaw to England to secure all the equipment they needed to begin the operation. As is obvious by the image on the screen, which is from the 1880s, the physical presence of the Phoenix Works became quite significant for the city. There were, not only did they take up more than half of the block on which Myer and Central Square now sit, but they took up the whole entirety of Dovedon Street with tracks for putting out the new trains to run them up and down, to run them in ready. There was also tremendous amounts of smoke coming from there day and night, and the glow of fires. So it would have been hard for the locals to avoid knowing what the Phoenix Foundry was and what it did, beyond the fact that the newspapers were romanticising what they did through huge stories. One in 1873 to celebrate the turning out of the first locomotive from the contract, and it spent 3 newspapers were used to completely tell the story of one afternoon's events. This is how significant it was to the people of Ballarat at the time. But this also opened it up to a degree of, can't think of the right word, but being picked on by Melbourne Punch. So it was growing its reputation. You know, we can fairly say that it was tall poppy syndrome, maybe, trying to cut down something that was growing bigger than the city warranted at the time. So by February 1874, there were approximately 160 workers working on the site. But by the mid-1880s, the newspaper reports of up to 450. So this change from servicing mainly the mining industry to specifically going after Victorian contracts had been a success. Another change, of course, was that the families of the leaders were growing older. So they'd been very young at the start. For William Shaw alone, the manager of the operation, he, between 1860 and 1882, he and his wife had 18 children. So he had adults and small children at this point to be looking after. This meant that they had a lot more that they desired a lot more out of this than simply the profit to live off, when they were considering that they had so many young people to deal with. Although the directorate includes a list of people many of you would be familiar with, like Daniel Brophy and Gilbert Duncan, Alexander Bell, and other members of the Victorian Parliament, 2 people in particular shaped the way the Phoenix Foundry grew. William Collad Smith was born in Cheshire to a successful cotton manufacturer. He was the youngest son, probably didn't have very many prospects at home for doing much of anything. So he came to Australia, where he first went to Melbourne and became an agent, unsuccessfully declared bankruptcy, and then came to Ballarat, where he became an auctioneer and experienced some outstanding successes. I don't have any real clues to his educational background, but I can only assume with his father being a successful industrialist, he received a half-decent education. William Henry Shaw was born in Ireland to a His grandfather was a medical doctor and his father was a building contractor. So unlike so many examples of what we see of the Irish that came to the area, he was a relatively privileged person and he was Anglican. So he had quite a different sort of impetus behind what he did to people like Daniel Brophy, who held strongly to their Catholic ideals. But both were dedicated to this idea of betterment through education. William Collad Smith, in his role as a parliamentarian, had led the drive towards education for all and was a key actor in the establishment of the Education Act of 1872 that led to free compulsory education for all. But through involvement with the people at the Phoenix Foundry, it became obvious that the Education Act didn't go far enough. And in 1873, when a local board of inquiry was asking for some feedback, they sent a delegation and requested the implementation of a free night school specifically for adults, with the goal that the workers of the Phoenix Foundry and another foundry that had opened by that point, the Union Foundry, could attend night school and attain a basic education. By the following year, this was up and running in the Dana Street Primary School. These seem like worthwhile endeavours and suggest some remarkable things about the sort of men that were involved. At the same time, though, I have to question, having become more familiar with what went on in the Foundry, I have to question whether or not they were really so morally clean. So in an address at the celebration of the turning out of the 100th locomotive in 1883, Smith stated, he believed that 2 or 3 of the most noted larrikins in Ballarat were furnished with employment at the Foundry, but the work took the larrikinism clean out of them. Let education be given to the youngster and let him have fair and reasonable means of obtaining employment, and we should not hear much of this cry of larrikinism. This mirrored something that had been stated only 10 years earlier at the celebration of the first locomotive being turned out, where Mr. Hugh Gray stated that in a conversation with Mr. Shaw, that gentleman had suggested that if anything was to come of the movement, it should be something practical and useful. He deprecated the idea of a banquet and thought the foundation of scholarships for the apprentices, in connection with the School of Mines, would be the most sensible plan of recognising the efforts of the company. Mr. Gray was also of this opinion. Mr. A. Anderson said it was a capital idea and he for one would give his 5 guineas towards it. It was most essential that technical education should be provided to the youths who were to become our future engineers. And now that so important an industry as engine making had been established in Ballarat, it should be fostered by every means in our power. The School of Mines too was greatly in need of support, and the scholarships would be a means of benefiting that institution as well as the Foundry employees. Mr. Martin endorsed the last speaker's remarks and said he hoped in time to see Ballarat become the Birmingham of the Australian colonies. It wasn't until April 1877, though, that we see the real fallout from that 1873 event when SMB added mechanical engineering to what they offered. And this was to be taught by William Henry Shaw and another man at the Foundry, Hugh Gray. Some of those classes actually occurred within the Foundry itself. So we start to see a tightening together of education and the Foundry and everything else they do. About the same time, they've also formed their own school of artisans within the Foundry. They had their own room where they did chemistry and other scientific experiments. And they shared lectures on all sorts of different topics, not to do with what their actual job. They weren't alone in this. This was quite a common practice across the board in big enough industries. But it is again an outreach of that the efforts that Smith had made towards making sure education was getting people to a higher level. I get back to my questioning though, the idea of improvement through education. Because when I look at the numbers of people who were employed within the foundry throughout this busiest period as a locomotive works, there were high numbers of apprentices. Anywhere up to 120 apprentices at a time were employed. Yet an apprenticeship with a foundry went for 7 years, with the first 2 to 3 years unpaid. There seems to me a little question to be raised about improvement through education, or, you know, is this a smart business decision to have free labour? Add to that to become an apprentice, the family had to pay a fee, and it's a real, there seems to be a real divide between helping the middle class and helping the lower class improve themselves. These would have been jobs only available to people already in a position to take them. So when we look at the idea that these were actually middle class, not people from lower classes having their positions improved through their apprenticeships, we start to find these indications in little stories, sometimes little advertisements in the back of the newspapers where the Phoenix Foundry people had put together dramatic clubs and glee clubs and quadrille clubs and a brass band. And see that, again, this is something that only people of a certain standing could have participated in. They needed time, they needed money. They also had a cricket team, lawn bowls. They were involved heavily in the foundation of lawn bowls locally, and football clubs. When I try to trace the people for these sorts of activities, though, it can be difficult. There's a huge difference between trying to find them listed in things to do with the foundry and then things to do with sport. Often they were only listed by their surname in the sporting events, so confirming who was involved in what can be somewhat of a difficult concept. I do find groups of them sometimes clustered by the neighbourhood in which they lived, playing on the same sports teams. So it is interesting to see that they do take sport on through the 1880s as something quite important to them. But the team itself, that the football club that came out of the Phoenix Foundry, was something altogether different and entirely remarkable. As an example, one apprentice and his brother, who in 1885 moved to Sydney to take on a job with the railways there, became foundational members of the Australian Rules Football Association. They weren't the only ones, they're just the ones that stand out the most. They have multiple entries online. So football was clearly something that was important. And I'd like to go back to at the start of when they first suggested football, and the reason I've got William Henry Shaw up here. Yes, he was all for education, but more than the education, he was for pushing the whole of life experience. So when football came into play with the local industries, so the foundries and the knitting mills and everyone else that was involved, William Henry Shaw actually set up the money for the Phoenix Foundry to have this start, and allowed the men to take a half-day holiday in order to start an industrial league locally. So I find this another remarkable thing about what went on. There's sort of little hints of truly being dedicated to the modern concepts, and little hints of being quite smart businessmen. The business strategy and the social strategies that they were using combined to see the foundry improve its turnout for the following 2 decades. There were more than 360 locomotives, dozens of large mining machines, and hundreds of various other products that came out. But when I talk about production, I don't just mean the things that they made. I'm also talking about production as in a visual performance, something you do on the stage. From as early as 1873, the School of Mines, the Phoenix Foundry, Winter's Freehold Claim, and the Botanical Gardens formed the core of visitor experiences to Ballarat, showcasing all it was capable of being in trying to become the Birmingham of the southern colonies. Images were printed in international journals of the activities in the foundry, showcasing the high level of engineering equipment that was being used. And then in February 1878, the first International Juvenile Industrial Exhibition was held here in Ballarat in the Albert Hall. Many of the members of the board for that were key figures of the foundry and had pushed and pushed for this to happen. Exhibitions were quite popular at this point. Out of that one event rose probably one of the biggest points of fame for the foundry, when 6 of the apprentices, including the previously mentioned Louis Bellhausen, built a model railway for display within the main building. This was a fully functioning locomotive, carriages, and a town, a miniature town of Ballarat, that then went on for the next 5 years to continue its travels through nearly every exhibition that happened in Australia and some overseas. They won multiple awards and were constantly mentioned. This is the sort of activity that I imagine Collad had dreamed would happen, the sort of recognition of the capacity to take your learning to something new. One of the more interesting performances of the foundry was something that had been taken from the foundries where many of them had learned back home in England, which was the Phoenix Foundry Brass Band. It began with a few members from within the foundry itself, and grew to a phenomenal size where it was requested for the following years to constantly attend lots of events for all sorts of other industries. It must have been pretty damn good. Their football team was another performance measure in taking a tour to Tasmania and another to Western Australia. So a foundry has, as much as it is a place that makes things, has become a place that makes society. All this learning that had gone on and this focus on improvement through education had raised the ambitions of a generation. There were 3 generations by the late 1880s working within the foundry, so roughly determined by the year of birth. There were those born in the 1830s who were the first generation, those born in the 1850s, some born in Australia and some born back in England, and those born in the 1870s who were nearly all wholly Australian born, who had grown up with the benefit of education, grown up fully emancipated with the vote. And they'd been taught to expect that they could have more. This led to a particular event, March 22nd of 1899, when 3 men were dismissed from the foundry and 96 men walked out and strike in response to this event. This is a 49-day strike. It's probably the most significant strike to ever happen in Ballarat. It went on to roll out to nearly every engineering and foundry workshop in the town and withdrew thousands of dollars of worth of income from circulation for the weeks it went on. Leading up to this had been a series of strikes. It was a worldwide phenomenon at this point that unions were growing and having more impact. There'd been strikes in London and Europe and on the Northern American continent, far more significant than this one, involving many more people. So it's easy to understand why this one may not have held much sway in the history books to this point. But it has a particular significance for Australians, and I'll get to that. Leading up to it, there'd been something called the Melbourne Circular that had come around. So the parent groups for unions had sent out a thing to say, we're not going to work within foundry workshops unless they pay us this certain amount and only work us this many hours. You know, so it had been going around, and they'd been pushing and pushing for this, and there'd been back and forth in the newspapers about it for months. And then on the day that these three men were sacked, they were sacked apparently for having been late to work. They weren't actually late to work. What had been happening within the foundry had been that these men had to come in and light the fires ahead of the time before everybody else arrived, and they weren't being paid for that. So it tied into the Melbourne Circular in that they were doing unpaid labour. The strike rolled out, more and more people became involved, and it became a much more public thing, being repeated in newspapers globally, which, you know, significant again. By April 30, so started March 22nd, by April 30, they were decided to reopen the foundry as a non-union workshop. They had some success at this, but, you know, they weren't completely able to lock out the union members, and the strike continued, and they weren't able to do all the work they'd been doing up to this point. That was April 30. On May 1, the Argus wrote a story confirming a rumour they had heard that the actual event that had started this strike was not the reason for all these events unfolding. In fact, the three men that had been sacked hadn't been sacked for being late, but because one of these men was the Labor candidate for that year's elections for Victorian Parliament, and the other two were his organisers. This was the first year that Labor had put forth candidates. Unfortunately for them, key director William Collad Smith was the standing member, and the directors didn't believe that they should have someone of the opposition working in their workforce, so they had laid them off. The honesty, at least, went some way to repairing some of the relationships with the people who had been on strike, and by May 10 there was a return to work, with some people not returning though, choosing to move on because they didn't want to work with people that preferenced the non-union members. A year on, and non-union men were refused entry that were working at the foundry were being refused entry to the union, even though the union rules said they should have had access. So it was a really tense situation that had arisen here. To my mind, this is more of an explanation as to why the Phoenix Foundry began to fail throughout the 1890s, rather than broad economic explanations of the depression that was going on. Combining that with some economic work that others have done that suggests that actually the metalworking industry was taking off in Ballarat at that time, it seems really, really clear to me that politics killed the Phoenix Foundry. Throughout the 1890s, they closed time and time again. It were inconsistent work. Sometimes only had 20 people working for them, and other times 120, depending on whether they'd managed to successfully receive another government contract. But they weren't being aggressive promotional people as they had been at the start. This, again, I put down to the strong influence of William Collad Smith, who in an address to his constituents in May of 1873 had stated, "I am not and never will be an advocate for frequent changes of government." I would dare to extend that to his to a preference for saying I am not and never will be an advocate for frequent changes of directorates. After the event, Samuel L. Bailey, who was one of the apprentices so fated for building the miniature railway and locomotive, and the Labor candidate, unsuccessful Labor candidate, went to South Australia, where he became a lay preacher and an active union organiser, and spent many years teaching people the ways of the Labor movement. He wasn't the only one to move on and become a successful Labor campaigner. In fact, there are a couple who went to Western Australia who became Labor members of Parliament as Labor candidates. Samuel L. Bailey then moved briefly to England and retired to Ballarat. So, the events probably had a huge emotional impact on him. That's a bit of a plotted history, a bit of a broken up history. It's really hard to tell the history of something as immense as this single foundry. I began my research 10 years ago. I've had about 3 years of that full-time and 7 years part-time, just potting around, doing whatever I wanted to do, looking at what interested me. The focus of my research has been people and how they affect the industry. In that 10 years, I've managed to create 1,802 pages of transcriptions solely about the Phoenix Foundry. They come from the newspapers, from the gazettes. They come from unpublished documents. So, there's a broad range of areas, but I still have a lot more to explore. I'd love to get into the old hospital records. I'd love to spend more time in Prov trying to find the things that don't come up in an index search. So that's that one. In those transcripts, I have nearly 1 million words. That's a lot of words to have to get through. There are 947 names found for the associated with the Phoenix Foundry. Of them, one is a female. So that's a nice little bit to have in there. There are people from German backgrounds and Swedish backgrounds and Norwegian and Irish and Welsh and very definitely British and Scottish. But it's still a very narrow draw for a country that now considers itself so multicultural. Of those 947 names, I've managed to identify 438 people and create genealogical records for them. I have some I will probably never solve. I have a Toby. Well, it may not even be his real name. It may just be the name he was known by in the shop, but I have a Toby, so that's probably not going to happen. As I've gone, I've managed to work out some with typos, and it meant John Robertson and John Robinson were the same person. And other times I've got a John Robinson who is actually referring to 3 different John Robinsons. So I imagine over time my list will grow shorter and it will grow longer. I have found 460 instances of work undertaken by the foundry, including mining work, railway. I haven't counted the individual locomotives, but the contracts themselves. Pipe works. So one interesting one that didn't mention in the history of it was in the late 1800s when Melbourne Water was building its massive extensions. William Shaw, along with a mate of his who was another engineer, won a contract to supply the pipes, and those pipes were supplied out of the Phoenix Foundry. I've managed to identify in all of my research 134 Ballarat foundries or engineering works. It's not so easy to do. Graham Cope in his master's thesis in the 70s wrote about how the labels in records are often misused. His example, of course, was engineers. engineers could have been someone driving an engine, or it could have been, in William Henry Shaw's case, somebody that made the engines. The word foundry gets misused a lot, or just doesn't appear for things that are foundries. So I identify it by the type of work they turn out and what they must then have had to have on their site to build those things. I have 956 separate Word documents to do with the foundries and the people who worked in them, and some of the businesses that they serviced. That's another more than 2 million words in transcriptions. Any questions? Right, I have a question here. Did the community type activities, e.g. the football, band, etc., reach out to the general Ballarat community, or were these only for the workers and members of the foundry? There was a very distinct line drawn between these. I find many of the men that were involved in the foundry ones were also involved in ones out in the community itself. So band members were involved in other bands, football players and cricket players were involved in other football and cricket teams. And the industry ones were, particularly in the sports, for the first few years, were far more robust than what was occurring out in the wider community. The football teams there seemed to struggle, obviously it took money to field a team, and people had to be able to find time to get together and practice as well as get together for the actual match. They were playing their games on random paddocks. They didn't have sports arenas of any description. So yes, there was something very, very different about the foundry teams. I have a question. Did any women work in the foundry? Was the woman you found a worker or associated in a different way? No women worked in the foundry that I've been able to find. There's nothing to say that a woman couldn't have easily worked in the office, because they had quite a few office people. But the only one I found was William Henry Shaw's wife. So when William Henry Shaw died, he left everything he owned to his wife. And she became a key shareholder, but at the meetings was represented by one of her sons who was a lawyer, which I suppose that makes sense. If you've got a lawyer in the family, you'll make the most of having them there. Am I intending to publish? Oh my God, yes. I've got multiple book outlines. I've got one that's just a general history of the foundry, because, there's people out there that are dorks that like that sort of stuff. I've got one that's about the people of the foundry, so expanding on the ideas of the social impacts, not telling you about the individuals, but like the social impacts that different sorts of groups could have. I've got another one that's just about, and it's probably going to be my first time, just about that strike. 49 days of activity, there was police brutality, there was people being followed home by the picketers to be bashed. So there's a whole lot of really interesting stuff that went on in that time, and I'd like to get that down. But more than anything, I'd like to get back to us discussing what Labor as a political identity is all about, so that we can, reinvigorate that idea that Labor is not the same as Liberal, and maybe have our politicians realise that they're not the same as one another. education was offered to workers. Do you know of any examples of what people did after working there? All right, so quite a few that had served full apprentices there, obviously full engineers, went on to work either in other large locomotive works in other colonies, or for the railways of those colonies. So New South Wales, Tasmania and West Australia saw a high number of people come from the Phoenix Foundry to join their teams in making locomotives. The Union Foundry of Ballarat started a branch in Maryborough, Queensland that became bigger than the Union Foundry here in Ballarat, and it was filled with people from the foundries here, including the Phoenix Foundry. Interesting enough, I have quite a few, I think it's, last count was 7, of the men became lay preachers, and that's how they finished out their life working. And just a few odd ones that went on to become storekeepers. You've got to imagine perhaps that they physically weren't capable of continuing their job at some point because they'd had injuries. Injuries were high, and this is why I'd like to get into the hospital records. Some of those are reported in the newspapers, and I'm sure I'll find a lot more going through line by line. Why did the foundry close? Right, so if you read our popular history books, the closure of the foundry was all about the rise of the labour movement and the argument of centralisation and decentralisation. It's not hard to see why they would say that, because the newspapers were full of years' worth of stories about the Newport workshops, which was the government's workshops for making, repairing locomotives is what it was set up for, but then it became a manufacturer. The argument goes that because the government was giving the contracts to them, the Phoenix Foundry could no longer keep working, and that was why it folded. But if you look at the history I've recorded, you've got a group of men, that first generation, were very eager to take on board and reform the industry however they had to keep it successful. And when you get towards the end of it, and we're into the third generation. So this was the manager at this point in 1906, so when it closed in 1906, had been an apprentice, served his whole career with the foundry, and he had this really solid proposal to revamp what was a steam engine manufacturer into a petrol engine manufacturer. This is right at the start of petrol engines. And it was knocked back, and you could suggest that, that a whole lot of political reasons behind that, but really the reason for that was because succession planning had been poor in the company. And something else that arose through the 1890s was the Ballarat Trustees and Agency Company. And a lot of these men of the first and second generation, when they died, to protect their families, had left everything in the hands of these trustees to make the decisions. The trustees' hands were tied because they had to make decisions to return the most money they could to the people that these things were in trust for. So John Glasson, who was the representative on the directorate at that point, for all of these shares, by 1906 was voting for probably the biggest block of shares available. He couldn't vote for something that was good for the foundry in the way that earlier decisions were made to just educate people and have social, decent social impacts. He had to vote for something that returned the best income for the shareholders he was representing. So I put that down to the real closure of the foundry was this failure to adequately plan for succession. Do you know anything about the recent commemoration of the Phoenix site reinterpretation of the site with the construction of Central Square? It's very poor. I know that the Engineers Australia have been involved in doing were involved in doing some research and stuff to help them sort of work it out. But there's a board there, an interpretive board there, that actually has a couple of factual errors on it. So I don't know who was involved in that, but I'd love to be able to talk to someone and see if we could do something a little bit more appropriate. Did the foundry make their own equipment? Where did it come from? Most of the foundry's equipment was imported from England. They figured if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We'll just get what we need from the people that were the best at making it. It was back in that time, in the early part of locomotive works, steel was still such a new industry, and very few people knew how to make it well enough to be able to put up with the pressure that these sorts of machines were under. So they imported, but they did in the later years, in the later 1880s, begin to make their own specialised cutting equipment and stuff like that. Do you know if the Phoenix High School was named after the Phoenix Foundry? I don't know. Phoenix, though, was quite a common symbol used for a lot of things. Phoenix insurance companies, you know, if you look back through the old newspapers in the advertising, you'll see Phoenix pops up a lot. So I don't know if it was specifically to do with that one. It's something I'll have to inquire about. Are any of the things trains made at the foundry still running? I don't know about running. There is a very famous, the first locomotive they made, which wasn't actually for the government, is over in Western Australia. It was made for a timber company over there, and it's been fully restored and sits. It's recently had some stories told about it. Other than that, up at Sovereign Hill, they have in the bakery an oven door, an oven that was made by the Phoenix Foundry with an oven door with the Phoenix symbol on it. So that one is still working. Are your transcriptions available online, or will you be making them available? Good question. I have my own website under No One History Chick, so it's NO1 History Chick, on which I'm making them all available through links to Amazon. So for the individual bios, it's 3 parts. There's the family tree I've put together, there's the transcription, and there's also a section with links or directions to how to find things that are copyright and I can't put in there. So I've got 7 of those up at the moment. They took a bit to get ready for online publishing. And that's all the questions. Thank you.